Welcome. My name's Rob Moody, and I'm chair of the advisory board to the Centre for Alcohol Policy and Research, and delighted to welcome you all today to the webinar really looking at the issues of lockdown, COVID, and the sober curious movement. And first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the many lands I think that we and all of us are on today, and to acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging, and to acknowledge the impacts that colonisation has had on, and the ongoing impacts that colonisation has had on First Nations peoples in Australia, to acknowledge that they've never ceded that custodianship of our lands. So today's event's it's going to run for about an hour, 40 minutes of facilitated discussion, and then we'll have Q&A. But please, if you have questions, just pop them into the Q&A at any time, or into the chat if there's a point of discussion, and we can fit them in as we're going along. So today is an opportunity for an in-depth discussion and conversation really around the changing landscape of alcohol availability and consumption, and the alternatives to drinking alcohol. As we'll hear, many people are drinking less, especially young people. There are an increasing range of alcohol-free drinks actually on the market. There's been the establishment and growth of the sober curious movements as well across the globe. But obviously, in the world's most lockdown city, Melbourne, and lockdown state, then being stuck in extended lockdowns has put extra stress on so many of us. Particularly those who are juggling, just in a sense, either responsibilities at work, at home at the same time, quite different changes. I think lockdown has affected virtually all of us in many different ways. Obviously, through this whole process, alcohol was seen as an essential product under lockdowns. It's readily available through bottle shops and home delivery. And as we know, the alcohol industry is always incredibly sophisticated in the way that they've been advertising around availability, and the notion of even that alcohol is a coping mechanism for lockdowns. Question, I guess, is, do lockdowns and working from home present a threat to the sober curious movement? How will the end of lockdown change people's drinking patterns? We are really pleased you've come online today. We really welcome your questions, so feel free, as I said before, put them in the Q&A, and we'll consider them, and I certainly want to ask those as early as we can. I'd like to introduce our three panelists and thank them all very much. Jill Stark, to kick off with. Jill is an award-winning journalist who I know very well, a best-selling author and passionate mental health advocate. Her first book was the brilliantly named High Sobriety, My Year Without Booze, explored Australia's binge drinking culture and, as she says, her own tumultuous relationship with alcohol. And her most recent books, Happy Never After and When You're Not Okay, also explore the link between drinking and mental health. She spent a decade, and is I think well known to many of us, on staff at The Age, covering health and social affairs as a campaigning senior writer and columnist. And prior to that, she cut her teeth in the tough newsrooms in Scotland, where she grew up. So welcome, Jill. Our next speaker is Sarah, aka Says Callinan. She's a senior research fellow at the Centre for Alcohol Policy Research at La Trobe. She has a PhD in educational psychology, and she specialises in survey research, working on multiple international projects examining drinking contexts and other influences on how much we drink. And her recent work really is focused on alcohol consumption at home. And our third speaker is Gabriel, aka Gabe Caluzzi. He's a postdoctoral research fellow at the Centre for Alcohol Policy Research. His PhD and his specialisation explored the changing drinking cultures amongst young people who chose to abstain from alcohol or drink lightly. And he's recently been working on a project looking at drinking practices during COVID lockdowns. So thank you to all three of you. Delighted to have you on board. And I just want to kick off, Sarah, with you actually, about just give us a sense of how has drinking in the home changed during the pandemic. Thanks.
So we conducted a couple of surveys here at CAPA asking people about how their consumption had changed. And before I give a quick summary of the results, I will just say that these were all convenience samples. So we're really keen to see, what happens when tax data gets released and when we find out, from more sources. But what it looked like to us is that while people were drinking more often during lockdowns, they were drinking less often when they did drink, and that resulted in overall a slight reduction. This was mainly, however, coming from younger people who usually drink more out of the home. If anything, there were some slight increases in older groups, particularly people who were maybe juggling lots of roles and things like that. So, which would probably explain why there's been increased calls for help in treatment services and so on. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. Now, Jill, you launched No Booze Day Tuesday during the pandemic. Why did you do it? What sparked it, and what's been the response?
Well, I actually started it on New Year's Day this year.
Nice work.
Because I think that's often the time, as you would know, Rob, my first book, High Sobriety, starts with the worst hangover of my life on New Year's Day 2011. And I was out at a New Year's Eve party on the night before, and I was talking about my sobriety, and I got a DM from a random man, as often happens on the internet, and he told me that while he loves my work, this was not my best moment. I would never get a husband if I was going to bang on about sobriety all the time. To which I said, well, I'm not looking for a husband, thanks, but if I was, I certainly wouldn't be looking for someone who's so uncomfortable with his own feelings that he can't bear the thought of not drinking. But it made me think about all the misconceptions we have about sobriety and people who don't drink. So I asked my Instagram followers, would you like to ask me some questions about sobriety? And I'll do it on New Year's Day, which is a time when a lot of people are reflecting on their drinking habits on the first day of a new year. And so I just got inundated with questions. I spent several hours on my New Year's Day talking about what I get out of sobriety, what I've learned from it. I had a year off the booze, and when I wrote the book in 2011, and then I went back to drinking, and I've now been sober for 2.5 years. So it's my second go at it. And so I got such a huge response that I decided to keep doing it. And it was actually my friend Clementine Ford who suggested that I call it No Booze Day Tuesday, and I have it on a Tuesday. So I did that, and it proved very popular. And particularly as Melbourne cycled in and out of lockdowns, it seemed that there was a correlation between the interest and when we were in lockdown, or even just coming out of lockdown, because often that's quite a difficult period as well for people to navigate. So yeah, I felt like there was definitely a growth in curiosity, as you say, curiosity, and the shift in the culture from 10 years ago from when I first quit drinking to now is quite extraordinary. And I think more people are looking to change their lifestyle and are seeing a movement that they can be part of. So whereas before I felt very much like I was an outlier. And, I mean, we still are swimming against the social tide, but not as much. There's more of us going upstream now than there was before.
And the current's not as strong.
No, and we have life rafts. We have, all these non-alcoholic beverages, which for some people obviously would always say that for people who have issues with dependency, that drinks that look and smell and taste like alcohol might not be the best idea, but for someone like me, I find them really helpful, and it helps to normalize not drinking and having something in your hand that looks just like the real thing, I guess, has changed that a little bit.
Lovely, thanks very much, Jill. Gabe, now, it moves directly into the area that you research on, and what's your research been telling us about young people's drinking, and how has the pandemic affected this particular age group?
Yeah, thanks, Rob. I guess my research is focused on young people, particularly kind of teenagers, where we've seen this kind of big drop off in drinking. So more teenagers abstaining, drinking lightly or just drinking proportionately less than kind of teenagers of generations before them. So my research was all around talking to teenagers who chose not to drink or chose only to drink a little bit, just to get a sense of, what their reasons were, what the kind of shift in youth drinking culture was, and sort of what the drivers were. Of course, there's a million reasons why people choose not to drink, but we saw this big shift in the way young people think about the future and the risks they associate with alcohol, including sort of the risks to their relationships, their mental health, their image. All these kind of concerns were sort of bundled together to kind of encourage them to drink less, or at least less than young people before them. As well as that, there was kind of a growth of social alternatives. So a lot of young people have a lot of new ways of socializing, which isn't necessarily with alcohol. We talked to a lot of young people last year, kind of midway through last year, during the pandemic, when we were seeing how drinking practices were changing. One of the things, Cez already sort of talked to it a little bit, but young people, for drinking is very much a social thing for a lot of young people. So when you shift everything sort of inside the home, particularly for young people, there's not the same kind of social appeal of, drinking with friends or having a big night out with your friends. So when we were talking to young people last year, drinking had sort of become a bit more secondary, and that's not to say that there weren't people who were drinking to help them, manage the anxiety and the stress of lockdown. But yeah, sort of the role of drinking changed when young people couldn't, get together and drink. So I guess it became a little bit more secondary during the pandemic.
Right, lovely. Thanks, Gam. So I guess for all of you, what's the sense you get of the current rates of drinking, or in fact drinking or non-drinking during the pandemic? Are they going to stick around, or is it going to shift back to pre-COVID levels? What's your view on this?
I have a feeling that in terms of what we found with those declines, particularly in young people, and this is separate to the sort of decline that's happening in youth drinking over the past decade or so, I imagine that once the licensed premises are back open, people go back. And I do think that having all the licensed premises shut down in a city, that's a massive change to the way that people consume alcohol. But I'm not convinced that would change, that people would then go less once they're open and available again, notwithstanding sort of the easing back. But once they're there and you can go back to them, I would assume that people are heading back.
And in fact, there's a sponsored advertising campaign run by Drinkwise to get people back to their local. There you go. So Jill or Gabe, where are we heading? Have we got permanent changes, or do you think we've got to, as it says, we'll go back to where we were?
I certainly think all of my, unlike Gabe and Sarah, I don't have any data to share. I only have my.
No, you got the vibe. It's all right. You pick up the vibe. It's okay.
Got a vibe from my Instagram following, but I definitely sense a shift in a lot of people, as you were outlining, Sarah, were perhaps drinking more in lockdown, particularly if they're juggling multiple stresses. And I think a lot of those, because my following is predominantly women, and from 25 to 55, and they're questioning their alcohol consumption, because unlike perhaps the younger people, as you were saying, Gabe, who are out socializing, these are perhaps people who would be more comfortable drinking at home, and then all of a sudden the only place they are is home. And alcohol, as you were saying, Rob, was constantly marketed as a way to manage stress during lockdown, which we know is a terrible coping tool, but that's when you're struggling, it's an easy thing to reach for. So I think a lot of people have really been shocked by how much they were drinking during lockdown and have wanted to shift that and change it. And I think that you're seeing more people. That's why, with No Booze Day Tuesday, it's like one day of the week where you cannot drink. So perhaps people are trying to have an alcohol-free day, or have or switch it up and have alcohol-free options on some occasions. I'm seeing that much more, even with there's some of the influencers. There's a woman, Olivia Molly Rogers, who's a former Miss Universe contestant who I did a live with. She's a model and an author and a mental health advocate, and I did a live with her during one of the lockdowns. And she'd be 29, I think, and she's got 180,000 followers on Instagram, and she was talking. She quit drinking because of her anxiety, and she just started talking about it, and that is so powerful. That kind of peer-to-peer conversation, and I'm now seeing other influencers of that age with similarly large followings saying, oh, you've inspired me, I'm going to have a couple of nights off, I've bought these alcohol-free drinks, I've never tried them before. So I think, I feel like me at 45, I've been banging on about this for a long time, but to have that younger age group talking about, like, to see people like Olivia who are kind of cool, right? She's out at Fashion Week and she's out doing all these openings and fashion shoots, to say, that you can not drink and still have this glamorous lifestyle, I think is really important. So I do think there's a shift, but yeah, I think we probably temper our expectations on how long lasting that is, or how many people get on board with the shift. But I think for a lot of people, there is a deep sense of reflection happening at the moment.
Yeah.
And I was going to jump in and say, the other thing is, when we talked to people last year, it's, you drink around everything else that's going on in your life as well. And, you've got hobbies, you're traveling, you've got to drop the kids off, you've got to go into work, you've got to come home from work. So once those things change, or once those things go back, I think, your drinking has to kind of return to being around those routines and activities you have as well. So I think when we were in lockdown, people didn't have all those things, right? They had all this free time, they had all these opportunities, and they had this stress of lockdown on them. I think drinking practices will change, and I think, as Jill was saying, there'll be a few people who sort of really reassess their relationship with alcohol, and hopefully, if they reduce their drinking and they feel better for it, they can maintain that.
Yep.
And I think, sorry, I was going to say, I think coming out of lockdown, a lot of people have messaged me and said they stopped drinking during lockdown and they were really okay with that, but then having to go back out into social situations, for someone like me who's been sober a long time, I've done everything. I've done weddings and dating and all of the things sober. So for someone who's maybe quit in lockdown and has only really had the four walls to navigate, to suddenly be able
to practice in.
Be out in social situations. And I think what doesn't really help with that, which is where we need to see cultural shift happening from the top down, is to have, our leaders say, get on the beers, that's the narrative of how we celebrate the end of this really traumatic period, is to have the Premier of the state, turning like his get on the beers kind of quote was turned into a dance floor mashup, and that's kind of seen as funny and cool. But what and for me, 2.5 years sober, I still really struggled with coming out of lockdown and feeling like, do I not go back to normal life because I'm not getting on the beers? Am I not part of this transition into post-lockdown, post-COVID world? Like, it's still very much seen as this is how we do it. We saw politicians standing in pubs at 10 a.m. with a beer to signify the pubs are open. Like, at what point did we say that day drinking is normal?
Is a good idea, yeah. And I guess the flip side to that, Jill, is the notion of are we seeing a greater acceptance of the whole sober curious movement? I mean, again, this did not exist 10 years ago, and where do you think that's going? Or do you think it's, as you're sort of alluding to, the notion of drinking being so embedded in our culture? Where do you think it's going to go?
I mean, I think like when High Sobriety came out, like I wrote it in 2011, it came out in 2013, and there wasn't really any other books like that on the market at the time. I think that was partly why it was so successful, because it was kind of like a new concept of this young woman quitting drinking, talking about it. And now we have an entire genre of quit lit, which is still men and women, but predominantly women talking about their sober journeys. And there's so many books out there which are really great and really helpful tools. But I think like the rise of the rise of this sort of non-alcoholic sober curious movement is really powerful. I mean, it's the fastest growing drinks category that's out there at the moment. That's extraordinary. Like my local bottle shop, their top selling beer is heaps more non-alcoholic drink. Not their top selling non-alcoholic beer. Their top selling beer of all the beers is a non-alcoholic beer. Like that's what's happening. There's a shift happening, and I think what that does is, as I say, it normalizes. It means that I can get on the beers. You know, I can.
Yeah, right.
For people who can safely drink drinks that are mimicking alcohol, you can have a beer and you can have a glass of wine and feel like you're part of it. Because I think that's something that, as you would know, Rob, the alcohol industry has very deliberately and cleverly marketed alcohol as belonging, you know, alcohol as a sense of you're part of the group. And I wrote about that extensively in High Sobriety. And I think that was the difference between me being sober then and me being sober now, is that I don't feel as much on the outer when I walk into a bar and there are options for me and I can have a drink that looks the same. Like I was at a Hens Day at the weekend, the first Hens Day I'd ever been to sober, and I brought some non-alcoholic champagne with me. So none of the other girls knew that I wasn't drinking until later in the night, when one of them handed me a non-alcoholic beer at the after party and was horrified and was like, "Oh my God, what is this? I'm so sorry. I'll get you a real beer." And I was like, "No, I brought these. These are mine." But yeah, so we've still got a way to go. I think some people are still kind of the concept. But
And the advantage is at the end of the night, you're a lot clearer. Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. I was by the time I left, I was like, "You guys are not going to be thanking me."
Look, we've got a question from Kath. I just want to ask you. She says, "I'm interested in your view on binge drinking in older people, the 40 plus." She says, I'm a former binge drinker, 49. I've been alcohol free for nearly 2.5 years, but I see so many women and men at this age group drinking at dangerous levels, which they haven't been for 30 plus years. I'd like to see a public health campaign targeted at this group, as I think it's a huge problem is not being directly addressed. So any of you can have a crack at that one?
Yeah, I think that there's definitely a tendency, and in fact we were discussing this before the seminar started, of wanting to just make alcohol a young people's problem and pretend that that's the only group experiencing harms from alcohol consumption. And because of the recent declines in youth drinking, it's not even really borne out by the stats anymore. More with the heavy episodic drinking, that it is more likely in that age group. But in terms of how much you're consuming overall, it's that the idea that it is a youth issue is just not holding up. And so I think it's an excellent point. And I also think that one of the other reasons we don't like to talk about sort of middle-aged and older drinking is because it happens in private homes. And so it's something that we can, because there's no one walking around on the street intoxicated, and then you can't get a good photo of it or whatever. I think we like to think of that alcohol consumption not having harms attached to it. But, in terms of those long-term medical outcomes and long-term medical harms from alcohol, it doesn't matter where you drank it. It doesn't matter if it was a nice bottle of wine on a nice couch in a nice house. It's still happening. And I do agree that it's definitely an area that has not received as much attention as it should.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks very much. Another question from Mary Walker. I'm wondering if there are any older movements, this is interesting, that are comparable or related. And she had in mind, I don't know about this, the straight edges of the 80s and onward. Are there similarities, or is that a distinct kind of cultural movement in your views?
It's funny because, I get asked sometimes, is this a movement among young people, something like the straight edge movement, or, a particular sober movement, or some kind of, reinvention of some kind of older temperance movement or something.
Yeah.
I think it's different in that, we're seeing like not necessarily only just, a group of people who don't want to drink, but I think, a slow shift towards, society accepting that and society accommodating non-drinking a little bit more. And I think it's slow, but I think it's sort of distinct from, having groups like that.
And is that the point that, I mean, obviously one of the big issues around temperance movement is the notion of it being a threat to the sense of people drinking. So in a sense, does the sober curious movement not pose that threat?
I mean, I think the sober curious movement is for people who, want to reassess their relationship with alcohol. And there's a whole lot as well within the sober curious movement. It's just people wanting to, look after their well-being, their sense of mental health as well, that maybe alcohol doesn't provide them or damages in some way.
Yeah.
So I think it's a little bit different from, having a particular sort of, a particular temperance movement, I suppose.
Yeah.
I think sobriety in this moment, in this point in history, is a form of rebellion. It's a form of defiance,
Right.
we used to think sobriety is boring and all of that, but I think a lot of the young people, it's kind of like, the way that a lot of young people were like, I'm getting AstraZeneca because they're telling me I shouldn't, and it's like, it's I think, yeah, when you live in a culture that tells you you need alcohol to belong, to celebrate, to feel confident, to be yourself, saying you don't need that, like, that's a pretty big statement. And I think that a lot of young people find that appealing. I mean, that's my sense anyway. And in like circling back to Catherine's question about the 40 plus age group, I think, yeah, like most of people in my age group have been drinking in problematic ways for several decades, as I would still be if I was still drinking. I started drinking when I was 13, and that was just normalized in Scotland. And I do think as well, for women in particular, you have this really insidious mummy wine culture that tells you that you need alcohol to survive motherhood, and that you deserve alcohol to get through tough times. And that's like one of the greatest myths that the alcohol industry has propagated to its great success, is that alcohol is a coping tool. Whereas I think back to the last nearly 2 years of this pandemic, and at the beginning of it, I thought, oh, I might as well just have a drink. At that point, I'd only been sober for about 6 months, and I might as well have a drink, because if I can't have a drink now, then when can I? But I don't know if I would have got through all the stresses of 6 lockdowns if I'd been hungover. So I think it's a myth that we need alcohol to cope, but it's a myth that's been very well peddled by.
Yeah. Thanks, Jill. Sarah, to you, this is really about ambulance call-outs and the fact that we've seen them related to drinking more during the pandemic, rather than from, we used to have them from the public sphere. They're now obviously coming from home. Should we be worried about this?
I think an increase in any kind of, ambulance-related call-outs is always a cause for concern. I would, however, be really interested to see, if there was a corresponding decrease from other areas. I tried to look at that and see. But I also think a really important thing to note is that that rise was 9%. Like, a lot of our ambulance call-outs were going to homes anyway. And so this is me just getting on my soapbox, but before the pandemic, 63% of all alcohol was consumed in the drinker's own home anyway. We're not social in our drinking as we think we are. And so whilst it is a cause for concern, I think it's also hopefully one of the things that we might take away from this, really difficult time, is the fact that a lot of our consumption is actually, just happening at home, not necessarily in a social way anyway. And if anyone's looking to reduce their consumption, thinking about how much they're drinking in their own homes is probably worthwhile. Even now the pandemic's over, but certainly when it was the only place you could drink, it was easier to think about it. Yeah.
Great. Thanks. Jill, I'm just interested in you, just to circle back a bit around you mentioned, I thought very well, the notion that you can buy non-alcohol or alcohol-free beer and in a sense be part of the group. So do you think that the rise of these alcohol-free drinks and bottle shops and bars that are completely alcohol-free, are they a good alternative to alcohol, or, I mean, the notion, could it possibly be a gateway to drinking?
Yeah, well, I mean, as I said before, whenever I talk about these drinks, because I get sent a lot of free non-alcoholic drinks people want me to try, and I always make the point that, like, I can drink these drinks and it doesn't make me want to drink alcohol, but for people who have a history of dependency, it can be a trigger. So you've got to really tread carefully there. But I think for most people, it's a good alternative. And I think a lot of my friends who are drinkers, since I stopped drinking, have seen what I've been drinking, and they now are buying more of these alternatives to have. Not that they're going completely sober, but they're having more nights of the week where they would try a non-alcoholic drink. And I think that's that kind of, again, peer-to-peer sort of example that can be set. I mean, I'm an ambassador for Brunswick Aces, which is Australia's first non-alcoholic bar. They've named a cocktail after me. It's called the Stark Reality, which I think is very fitting.
Wow.
Because, the stark reality of sobriety, as I always say, is the best thing about sobriety is you get to feel all your feelings, and the worst thing about sobriety is you get to feel all your feelings. So that's the stark reality. I think that's just such a shift. Like this bar that's open not far from my house in Brunswick, I knew when it arrived that it would be a game changer, not just for the bar itself, but for all the bars in the area. And you've seen that, like, it's had this domino effect where build it and they will come. And if there's a demand, a publican can charge me more for a non-alcoholic beer than he can for soda water. So it just makes sense. I've been saying that for years. And I said in High Sobriety, we are so far behind the rest of the world. Like Europe has had in pubs in Spain, they've had non-alcoholic beer on tap since I wrote High Sobriety 10 years ago. And I think we're seeing that now. We're a bit behind, but the exponential growth in that category of drinks suggests that there's a huge demand out there. And what that does is it normalizes sobriety, which gives people permission to give it a crack. And then when you don't feel like you're going to be the odd one out, you're more likely to drink less or to not drink at all. So it's, as Sarah has pointed out before, it's not just about sobriety, it's about harm minimization as well. So for people who may still drink, but might drink less and might have more occasions when they choose not to drink. So I think it's a good thing. In regard to your question about whether or not, I know there's some concern at the moment about having those drinks on the supermarket shelves. I mean, I would say that, like, actual alcohol has been on the supermarket shelves in the UK forever. But to have drinks that look like alcohol next to the Coke and the lemonade, is that a good thing? I don't know the answer to that. I would bow to the researchers on that. But I think I've also heard the argument from Uni Steins, who's got a public profile and is a non-drinker, and she had a history of addiction, and she was making the point that she likes having these drinks in the supermarket because the thought of walking into a Dan Murphy's to buy her non-alcoholic beer is really triggering for her, and that could actually lead to a relapse. So having it on a supermarket shelf means she doesn't have to go into that environment. So you could argue both sides of that, I guess, depending on who's.
And I guess we have to ask our researchers whether they're going to research this.
I mean, with a lot of things, if we can find funding to do so, absolutely. I think it's certainly an area of interest, because I think, like Jill pointed out, there's a range of like conflicting concerns. That idea of you don't want to make someone walk into, the bottle shop area if they don't want to, but also maybe someone else doesn't want to be going down the Coke aisle and see, like an alcohol brand or something like that as well. Which is, and of course, another concern is that the non-alcoholic products are being used to develop an alcohol brand, so that you can advertise in times or in places or in ways that wouldn't be appropriate for an alcoholic product, but you could for a non-alcoholic product. And I think, as Jill also touched on before, for some people, having a sort of a cocktail looking drink with no alcohol in it is not a great idea for them, and for other people it works really well. So there's a lot going on there, and there's definitely a lot to look into, which we would absolutely love to do, but haven't done a lot on yet.
Right. We'll wait for that for the next one. Sarah, while I've got you, I mean, in terms of the notion of Jimmy brings or delivers, this notion of rapid alcohol delivery, I mean, it started before the pandemic, but it's really, I think, speeded up during the pandemics. and the fact that you can restaurants or delivering alcohol with a meal. Do you think this is affecting the way we consume?
I think it certainly has the potential to affect a lot of the things that we've put in place to try and reduce alcohol-related harms. I think there's been a huge effort to make sure in the past that there aren't too many licensed premises in a given area or too many places that will sell alcohol to consume elsewhere. And of course, if you can have it delivered to your home, a lot of that stuff just sort of goes out the window. But I think in particular, if you're getting some drinks delivered with a meal and you're paying sort of restaurant prices, that kind of alcohol often isn't linked with particularly risky drinking because it's quite expensive. And if it takes a couple of days for it to get delivered, then it's probably not an impulsive purchase. And again, it's probably not as strongly linked with harm. But what we're particularly concerned about is when you can have bottle shop price alcohol delivered to your house quite quickly. And those combination of two things, that can the high convenience and the low price, has been linked with increased harm and increased risky drinking. And we are quite concerned about that means in the long term.
Sure, thanks. Gabe, coming to you in terms of your own work on really quite in-depth interviews with young people who are light drinkers and non-drinkers. Did you find there any appetite for alcohol-free drinks, or is that a alternative? Is that a moot point amongst that particular cohort?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't think providing an alternative is a moot point. It gives people the option if they do want to not drink and then want to have like a non-alcoholic beer or something. I think when I talk to the young people, I mean, the young people I was talking to specifically were kind of in their late teens. And actually, one of the reasons why they didn't drink, or one of the supporting reasons, was because they didn't like the taste of alcohol. So among them, it's not like, they didn't really want to substitute, with an alcohol-free beer. They would rather have, something like a fizzy drink or soda water or something like that. I think with a slightly older cohort, so when you're looking at, I guess, like young adults and people who have gotten used to drinking and used to the taste of drinking, people who do like the taste of beer, I think it is a valuable alternative. Just for people who want to drink less, don't want to drink on a night out, or maybe want to experiment with alcohol-free things. So it's definitely not a moot point, but it's more for people who've, I guess, gained that, enjoyment or taste from drinking alcohol, or things that taste like alcohol.
And just going back to the previous discussion we had about declining rates of drinking amongst younger people, can you tell us a bit more about that in terms of the differentiation? Was there, are there gender differences? Are there differences between rural and urban? Other socio-economic or socio-demographic differences that you're seeing where changes are occurring and others might not be occurring?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of happening across the board, right? So the declines are happening across, different SES groups across different sort of geographic regions. So we're not seeing it, specifically in one group that, it is or isn't declining. That being said, I think there are, always going to be factors that play into things. If people, and a lot of the young people we talk to, have things to focus on. They have hobbies, they have other, they have, their education that they're really focused on. So I think, providing people, opportunities and, areas that they can focus on, that sort of drive them and, maybe reduce their need or their desire to drink. I think that's also part of it as well. And there will always be things like, there's gendered forms of drinking, like these notions of, men drink beer or women drink wine kind of thing. And I think that's changing among younger people. But I think it still probably exists to a degree. So there are these kind of, small differences in the way people drink and the way young people drink as well.
And there's an assumption that, well, if they're not drinking, they're taking something else. Yeah,
which is not true. Because drinking is going down, but so is drug use, so is crime, so all these kind of areas, or so-called sort of risk behaviors as well. So no, young people are not doing more drugs or substituting alcohol with drugs.
So we're just getting a safer, younger cohort, which is lovely. So we're being replaced by good people. That's great. No. And I guess to all of you, as obviously the restrictions ease, at least for a while before we head back to winter, I guess. But as the party season starts, Christmas, New Year, how do we go about best supporting people who don't drink or want to change their relationship with alcohol? Jill, you may want to kick off with it.
Yeah, well, I think the first thing to do, which is something that I was guilty of back in the day when I was a drinker, is if someone is choosing not to drink, don't interrogate them, or don't tell them they're un-Australian or boring or all the many things that I've been called over the years. And also, I think for the person who is choosing not to drink, what I often say is if you explain to the people in your life why you're not drinking, it often makes it more difficult for them not to support you. So if you say, oh, like for me, it's like, this is a mental health reason, like I feel so much better in myself since I stopped drinking, or whatever it might be, the reasons are usually quite personal. And if you're willing to share that vulnerability and say, well, this is the best choice for me, people tend to be supportive, and it takes away that sense of defensiveness that they have, because often people's reaction to your sobriety is a reflection of you're holding up a mirror to their own relationship with alcohol, which they might not be comfortable with. So I think it's for the non-drinker or the sober curious person, I would say, remember that another person's reaction to your choice not to drink has everything to do with them and nothing to do with you. And to the person who wants to be supportive, then try and arrange activities that don't revolve around the pub or don't revolve around alcohol. Try and make sure you have interesting options, not just sparkling mineral water, but interesting options for people. If you're throwing a work party or any kind of party, like, be inventive. There's no excuse anymore. There's entire bottle shops full of, at Brunswick Aces, for example, or full of options for non-alcoholic drinks that you could provide to people. And I think, just taking away that sense of judgment and trying to be supportive of people. And if you are wanting to encourage someone else to drink a bit less, which is a question I often get asked, how do I get my brother, sister, wife, husband to son to drink less? It's like, well, you can't, that's not how behavior change works, but you can role model by drinking less yourself, or talking about the benefits of sobriety or moderation to that person, and making choices that give them the space to often do the same.
Yeah, and I think you actually raise a really interesting sort of almost sort of social construct, where this notion of expressing your own vulnerability takes down the defenses of the person you're talking with. I mean, there's a certain irony in it, but it happens a lot in terms of the more vulnerable you can be, the easier it makes for the other person.
Well, and I think that's, again, it's, as you say, it's an irony, and I wrote about this in High Sobriety, is that when we choose to drink, it's a sort of social contract to let down our inhibitions and to kind of strip ourselves bare. And when one person chooses not to drink, the other person can feel like that there's an imbalance of that vulnerability. So I've made a point of trying to do and say not all the things I used to do when I was drunk, because let's be honest, a lot of them were very silly and reckless, but to try and be emotionally open and authentic and vulnerable with the people in my life. So, that 2 a.m. I love you, I really love you kind of wine tainted declaration, I do that, but I do it completely sober, so that the person, because then the person wakes up knowing that what I said was 100% coming from me, not from the bottom of a bottle. So I think that has been one of the greatest gifts to me of sobriety, is that
wonderful,
that connection.
That's a lovely story. I'll come back to Gabe and says on this that issue about how we support people, but I just want to take Lisa Fry's question, which is, do you think that the afterpay introduced into bars and pubs recently will have a large impact? Is it even ethical?
I think that there's a couple of factors going on there. One of them similar to the idea of the home delivery, where, again, just one of the sort of barriers or put in place to sort of help people stop drinking, which was just running out of cash, is being taken away.
Yeah.
So, you know, you can, but I suppose the other big issue is more economic. Like, are people, you know, completely aware of, in that moment, of the costs involved and the, you know, and how much they'll end up paying as well. And of course, that the ramifications of that will affect some people more than others. And so there's a socioeconomic sort of issue in place there, as well as the public health one. And it's something we should be looking at quite carefully. I think there is potential for problems. I'm not sure if Gabe would feel.
No, I'm just echoing exactly what you said. Yeah, it's the kind of thing that affects particular socioeconomic groups more than others, which is always problematic. And yeah, introducing new ways for people to pay with money that they don't necessarily have while intoxicated, definitely does raise a lot of ethical issues.
And as someone who used to wake up the next morning and realize I shouted the whole bar like around a cocktail, like, and that's when I could afford it, right? But if you don't have access to that, and then you wake up and you've got, as you say, Sarah, it becomes the most disadvantaged people, and we know that is what the industry has done. And I think that we are going to see perhaps the question around, is our lockdowns a threat to the sober curious movement? You flip that on its head. Is the sober curious movement a threat to the industry, and what ways are we going to see them trying to circumvent that and create profit? And so just going back to the influencer that I was talking about before, who's got 180,000 followers and recently went sober, and it didn't take long before Dan Murphy's had sponsored her by sending her all of these alcohol-free products. Now, I felt deeply uncomfortable about it, because although she was spruiking alcohol-free products, I would never work with that company, because, as you know, Rob, I wrote many stories about them going into dry Aboriginal communities or trying to put massive Dan Murphy superstores into the most disadvantaged areas in Melbourne and in Aboriginal and remote communities. So I feel like nothing that those companies do comes from a place of altruism or maybe I'm really cynical, but I think them sponsoring influencers with their non-alcoholic products gets people in the door to their stores, you know. It's
a little like e-cigs and tobacco. And maybe coming back to you, Sarah and Gabe, around this issue of how can we best support people who don't drink and want to change their relationship with alcohol.
You?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think a lot of people have sort of reassessed their relationships with alcohol. And that was the kind of the sense when we were talking to people last year. You know, lockdown was, you know, at first a novelty, but then it was, you know, like a lot of time for people to think about, you know, the way that they drank, and, you know, whether it was something they wanted to continue or wanted to change. I think it's going to be hard for people going into a summer, which, you know, as we all know, yes, has been touted as like the summer of getting on the beers. But I think, you know, being mindful that, you know, people have gone through a lot of struggles during lockdown, a lot of personal things. And, you know, their relationship with alcohol is only like, you know, one element of so many other things that have been going on in people's lives. So I think, you know, it's on everyone to be a little bit mindful of, you know, what's been going on with people, and, you know, to accommodate, you know, people who don't want to drink. And I think that's absolutely fine. And that's where I think, you know, the strength of, you know, the sober curious movement, and even like temporary sobriety initiatives, you know, like, you know, Feb Fast, Dry July, people just taking the initiative to say, like, you know, I would like to take a month off alcohol. I think they're really good, because it just gives people, you know, a way, you know, to change their relationship with alcohol. But it's a bit more socially accommodated as well. And then people feel are connected to, you know, a network of other people who are doing sort of a similar thing as well.
Yeah, and I guess it does help people understand their relationship with alcohol much more clearly by having a breather. Sarah.
Yeah, so I've done some work with a PhD student I'm working with, Chris Cheers, and he's done some excellent work talking to drinkers about how they view non-drinkers. And it was really interesting to hear Jill talk, because it was a lot of what we found was very similar to what she was saying before, in that there's almost like a checklist that some people go through, like, are you pregnant? Is it because of religion? Is there a acute health reason? And if it's none of those things, then the response can be kind of, oh, you think you're better than me. It is sort of that reflection of making people sort of, visit their own decisions and so on. And of course, and that's not everyone, but, it does tend to be the people who maybe are a little worried about their own consumption. And so if someone's making that choice, that can be quite confronting. So something that came through from the discussions with the non-drinkers was this idea of, I just don't want the quiz. I don't want to have to answer all the questions about why I'm choosing to do this. Like, if you say not drinking, you can say nothing. Like, that's an option. And so, and that was definitely something that came through in Chris's work, was sort of just having to defend this choice, which sort of, speaks to how deeply embedded it all is in the way that we socialize and with each other in a lot of those situations.
And that's why I really like Jill's comment about come out with a reason, because that puts the whole discussion on a completely different, generally speaking, on a completely different, you need more courage, and you've got to, often it's harder to be vulnerable with people with whom you don't feel necessarily safe, but it's a really interesting way of going about it. So I might just ask you all now for your final wrap-up summary comments. And Jill, can I come to you first? Thanks.
Yeah, I feel like we're really at an inflection point here. Obviously, we're at an inflection point in history with the pandemic, but I think we're also at a tipping point with the sobriety movement in a way that I just never thought was possible.
Yep.
I think things are shifting so quickly, and I would love to see it one day. Rob, we used to write all those stories about tobacco and quit, and we could we see a time where alcohol, like the idea that we'd have footballers running around with Carlton Draft on their backs, will suddenly seem alien to us. That day doesn't seem too far away to me now. I think, as Sarah was saying, alcohol is the only drug that we have to justify not taking. When we are in social situations, we have to, well, we don't actually have to, which is what I often tell people, you actually don't have to justify yourself, but that's the culture which we inhabit. And I think that will shift. And the reason it will shift is because of more conversations like this. And when people have that peer-to-peer example of people living full and meaningful, fun lives, when you see that mostly people drink for two reasons: to reduce pain or to increase pleasure. And when you learn to do both of those things without alcohol, that's true freedom. And I think that's when we have more people get to that point, we will be in a much better place.
Lovely, thanks, Jill. Sarah.
I suppose just for me, one of the really important things to remember is that even though consumption shifted into homes during the pandemic, that's where most of it's been happening all along anyway. And it's probably, and, if there are people who are looking to, who are worried about, how much they're drinking, but don't want to give up the social aspect, for instance, it's always looking at how much you drink at home is always worthwhile, because I think they're the drinks that we don't think about. They're the ones that just happen automatically without a lot of thought. And maybe you're actually getting less pleasure from them as a result. So, keep the ones that, if there's situations that bring you joy, great. The ones you're not even thinking about, then the ones that can go. That would be it for me.
Lovely, thanks, Sarah. And Gabe.
Yeah, I think as we come out of lockdowns and we come out of the pandemic, I do think a lot of people's drinking practices will probably go back to where they were pre-pandemic, but I think you'll also get a segment of people who kind of reassess their relationship with alcohol, and maybe you're going to reduce their drinking or stop drinking completely. And I think you're also going to get probably some people who whose drinking practices changed and maybe leave lockdown drinking more than what they were prior to lockdown. So I think it's important to sort of accommodate the former, but also be aware of the latter, and just be aware of the pandemic has been complex and it's been really hard on a lot of people. So understanding that, you know, people have their own ways of dealing with things is going to be really important going to the future.
Lovely. A good note to finish on. And if I can thank you, Jill, Sarah and Gabe very much, for being online today, but also for the work you do both as commentators, influencers, researchers. We really appreciate the work that you do. So thanks heaps for being online, and thanks to Megan Cook and Lindsay McIntyre for helping us all. And we'll see you at the next one. So thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rob.
Cheers.